programmer and a data scientist here in Chicago. I'm excited to see all of you. I hear we had a sold out event. Is that what it's called when there's a wait list?
Crushing it.
So do I get to say I've sold out a venue now? Can I put that on my resume? I think I will. Why not? Cool. So yeah, software engineer, data scientist. Today I'm going to be talking about leveling up. This talk is not Python specific, but I have used the skills that I'm going to talk about today in a number of Python related projects and applications. So I'm hoping it will be applicable, and I'd be interested to hear y'all's feedback at the end. This is where you can find me on Twitter. I'm pretty vocal about social justice things, so if you're not into that, maybe don't follow me, but if you are into that, then feel free to follow. ChelseaTroy.com is where I talk about tech. There's not as much social justice on there. It's a lot of like Python, JavaScript, Swift, and leveling up related technical things. Okay, so we're talking about leveling up today. And by leveling up, what do I mean? I mean here taking responsibility for building our own skills, either upskilling on something that we already kind of know how to do, or building a new skill completely from scratch. So what qualifies me to talk about this? Well, when I started my programming career, I started at a place called Pivotal Labs. Pivotal Labs is a consultancy. They have clients who bring in greenfield projects of all different languages and frameworks. So in my first 3 years as a programmer, I needed to pick up all of these languages. Pivotal charges $250 an hour for their programmers' time, so you need to at least appear as if you know what you're doing pretty quickly. So I developed a process that I would use that allowed me to get up to that level in a programming language within 2 to 3 weeks of picking it up. I called it steep ramping. It got easier the more languages I picked up because I had background from other languages. That having been said, this is kind of an extreme case, right? This isn't necessarily something that you need to do in your career in a lot of places. That having been said, even if you're writing the same programming language, let's say Python your whole career, tech is a fast-changing field. So the languages change pretty quickly, and the frameworks also change pretty quickly. The rule of thumb that I typically use here is about 8 months. If somebody's out of a language or framework for 8 months, and then they come back to it, that's where their skills are going to be more or less obsolete. Almost everything will have changed in a given like ecosystem of libraries and languages in about a year. You'll be able to pick things up, but there will be a lot of learning that has to be done. So this is the reason that the leveling up skill is so valuable. Do you have any Dungeons and Dragons players in the room? You? Okay. How about these video games like Mario Kart? I think this is Harry Potter, but any sort of like role-playing video game will do. A few, okay, good. So the way that leveling up in these types of things works is similar to the way that we typically level up in the workplace, right? You go in and you're working on your project, you do the things that you have to do in the fulfillment of your job or in the game, and you gain experience that way. And as you gain experience, you level up incrementally from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, right? You level up incrementally by gaining experience. That, we all learn to do that as programmers. We learn to Google the error message. We learn to sort of muddle our way through things. Sometimes we'll use books. I call that leveling up passively. That's not because it's a process where you don't put in any effort, but it's something that you do on the job rather than taking a systematic approach to upskilling. But this is how we know that we're able to level up, right? It can feel sometimes like, oh, I don't know how I could upskill at that. I don't know that I could pick up a new skill that I don't know anything about. But the truth is you do it all the time at your job. If you've been a programmer for more than 8 months, then you have survived an obsolescence cycle, right? Which means that you already have the skill set to level up. So that's what we're enhancing today. We're taking this leveling up passively that we've all learned to do. And we're talking about how to turn that into a deliberate process, how to level up deliberately. So what does it mean to level up deliberately? We're going to talk about 4 different things in this area. What does it mean to level up deliberately? And I'll share these slides at the end, so if you don't want to have to note these down, you don't need to. I also have the full transcript of this talk on my blog, so you'll be able to go back and Okay. So the first principle of leveling up, developing a specific vision. About 2.5 years ago now, I thought that I really wanted to become a machine learning engineer. I was really interested in finding out how to do machine learning, which is a great goal, but the thing about that goal is that it's completely not specific, right? I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do. And I started, I think the same way a lot of folks start. I started with a Coursera course, and I started with a book. And those are good ways to start, but they weren't able to get me all the way there. And the reasons that they weren't able to get me all the way there were two. They both have to do with me. The first one is that I love to dig holes. If I'm watching a Coursera video and I run into something that I don't understand, I stop the video and I go and I look it up. And then if I'm in the article where I'm looking the thing up and I find something that I don't understand, I go and I look something else up. And so on and so forth, all the way down the rabbit hole until I don't know where I started. So this is the first reason that coursework approach didn't necessarily work so well for me. The other thing about that approach is that it left me subject to what I call mood metrics. What I mean by mood metrics is that on days when I had slept and I had eaten well and I was feeling good about myself, on those days I was very proud of the progress that I had made. And maybe I would make a little more progress that day. And maybe I would work on it so much that day that I got to bed late, didn't eat dinner or something, and then that's not true. I never forget to eat. I never forget to eat. But maybe I ate Reese's Cups for dinner instead of making dinner. That's more accurate. That would happen to me. And I wake up the next day and I don't feel so good, even though objectively I felt very good about my progress the previous day and made more progress on that day. Today, my mood's not as good, and as a result, I feel like I haven't gotten anywhere. I don't know anything about this, and I'm going to die having never become a successful technologist. Obviously. I've known this all along. So that makes it a little tough to make progress.
I apologize, but they are doing construction on the level above us, so
that's okay.
Nobody's crying out for help.
That's exactly what you would say. So the incremental sort of coursework book approach wasn't necessarily working for me. What I found ended up working a lot better for me was to take on practice projects. So each day I would do a little bit more work towards one of my practice projects. And those practice projects were helpful for me because they forced me to stop and ask myself, why do I want to do machine learning? What am I trying to accomplish with this skill set? Well, if I were a capable machine learning engineer, then I might be able to build an app that would allow me to help companies identify bias in their compensation packages. So I built an app that would do that. And if I were a machine learning engineer, then maybe I could find a way to make it easier for machine learning engineers to visualize the results of a model and understand how it made decisions, so that when we show the model to subject matter experts who aren't necessarily experts on machine learning, they can understand why the model thinks what it does based on the data we've given it. So I started doing that. I started writing data visualizations for linear regressors and linear classifiers. And if I were a machine learning engineer, then maybe I would be able to take the principles of solid software engineering that I'm so familiar with, like test-driven development and continuous integration and collaboration, and maybe I would be able to apply those to the machine learning field where we're a little bit behind on that. So I started doing that. And these projects, I'm not going to tell you that they completely halted my hole digging, but they put a floor on the depth of where I would dig my hole to, because now I was no longer learning just to learn. I was learning in service of a specific goal. I need to be able to do whatever the next step is on this project. And once I've gotten deep enough to get the answer that I need to move on with this project, then I would stop digging the hole because I was motivated to keep moving forward on my project. So these projects are really helpful for me in being able to level up because they gave me a purpose and they gave me a max depth to dig to. So that's my first principle for leveling up deliberately. The second one is to rely on discipline. I have a secret for how to stay motivated across a really long slog over a long period of time. My secret is don't. I don't. I don't think it's possible, actually. I don't think it's possible to stay motivated at all times over a long slog. Even things that I really, really want to do. I really want to get better as an athlete, or I really want to get better as a programmer. Even if I know objectively I really want to do those things, there are days when I wake up and I do not want to do the work. And that's okay. I think we all have days like that. So rather than pretend I won't, I've developed coping strategies to get through those days. The first one is that I rely on a routine. So I'm a CrossFit athlete. I did my first competition last weekend. It was a surprise. I found out 6 minutes before the competition that I would be in it. It was fun though. I really enjoy working out in the morning. I like to have that routine. I like to get up. I like to make my coffee. I enjoy my walk in the morning to the gym, and then I get to ride that endorphin rush to work afterwards and watch the sunrise. I enjoy that routine. I've built it in. And so it feels less like a motivational effort to get me up in the morning to do that, because it's something that I have built into my day already. And I find that helpful for leveling up as a programmer as well. If I have 2 hours at the end of the workday or at the beginning of the workday, or an hour at lunch that I devote to some skill that I'm trying to develop, when I have that built into my routine, I rely less on motivation. It feels more like a default for me to spend that time on. Second of all, I have a contingency plan on days when I don't feel like it. When I get up in the morning and I don't want to work out, it happens. I don't freak out about not wanting to work out and feel like maybe I never wanted to be an athlete all along. Instead, I have a nice batch of coffee that my friend gave me that I use. That's my special coffee that I get to have specifically on days when I don't feel like going to the gym. And I also have a couple of t-shirts that I wear on days when I do not want to go to the gym. One of them says "because I said I would," and one says in all caps, "I don't wanna." It's my favorite one. So on days when I get up and I don't want to go to the gym, I have this contingency plan. I get to have my special coffee. I get to put on one of my favorite shirts, and I go to the gym anyway. And on those days, maybe it's not the best workout, but I'm there and I've done it. And I get to appreciate that about myself and put a gold star in my calendar, in my journal. My third trick is to keep a calendar or a journal. This is a tactic that I developed in college about a while ago, many, many years ago. And I have found it helpful for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I can look forward on days when I don't feel like going to the gym. I can look forward to putting a star in my calendar that indicates I didn't want to go on this day and I went anyway. Then later, I can look back at my calendar and I can see all of the days with stars on them and recognize that about 20% of the time that I spent at the gym, I didn't want to be there, and that's 20% that wouldn't be there if I hadn't been able to rely on my discipline, which gives me this a feeling of accomplishment for having been able to rely on that discipline. The other thing that's helpful about a calendar is then when I feel like I'm not making progress, when I find myself subjected to those mood metrics, I can look back in my calendar and look at what I was doing a week or a month or a year ago and realize that even on my worst day now, I'm able to do things that I wasn't able to do on my best day then. And that helps hold me accountable to the progress I have made so that the mood metrics can't convince me that I haven't made any progress at all. So that's my second principle for leveling up deliberately. My third one is to start with questions. So we've talked a little bit about where to start when we are trying to level up with something. We've talked about books. We've talked about courses. Like I said, those things didn't work so well for me. When I'm approaching a source, like a book or an article, rather than read it from start to finish and end up in a rabbit hole, I found it helpful for me to start with a series of questions that I want to have answered, and then go hunting through different sources until I find the answers to the questions that interest me. For example, suppose I wanted to learn about HTTP requests or something. I know that major companies started doing HTTP requests in 1989, 1990, but I also know that information transfer over the internet started around 1969, right? So maybe one of my questions as I'm reading about HTTP requests is what happened in that intervening period between 1969 and 1989? How did we get from the first information transfer over the internet to where we are now? Or maybe I'm interested in knowing, where did all of these ideas about REST come from? You know, people have these ideas about what REST is, whether it's good to do it, should we be using GraphQL now, what is that? Have we ever done something like that before? I start with questions, and then I go hunting for answers. That makes reading through sources feel much less like following a program that somebody else has put for me. And instead, it feels more like solving a mystery, where I get to decide what the goal at the end of the mystery is. I get to decide what mystery to solve, and I find that that's helpful for me. When I can't find the answers I'm looking for in sources, I've developed a habit of asking for help. Sometimes in programming, it can feel very much like we're alone, and maybe we don't necessarily know where to turn to find answers to things. I have found it useful on numerous occasions to turn to a colleague and ask about stuff when I can't find the answer in a book or on the internet. Or even somebody who worked with the open source library that I'm trying to work on. Or somebody on Twitter or on a Gitter forum who also works with the library I'm trying to work with. I'm not going to say that it happens all of the time, but on many occasions I have been floored by the generosity of complete strangers. I have had, one time I was working with the Spring Library, I needed to do something a little bit complicated with the authentication mechanism in there. And I couldn't find documentation on how to get it to work, so one of the maintainers made time to pair with me until we got it working. And then one time I was working with a machine learning library that uses a data structure called D-matrix. I couldn't find any information about how that worked under the hood. So I found someone on LinkedIn who had used it for their PhD research, and they were able to help me understand how it worked. I'd never met this person before in my life, but I have found that asking those questions of people has helped me find answers that I wouldn't otherwise find. And in the worst case scenario, they don't know the answer, but now I've met somebody. Which brings me to my last principle for leveling up, which is to take care of each other. So when I started working at Pivotal Labs, a while after I started working at Pivotal Labs, I was working on an Android project and I had not done Android before, so I started doing something called commit tracing. I rolled onto this project. It was an existing application that some senior developers had been working on so far. And I would come in the morning and I would pick a commit that had been made in the past couple of days. Something that had an interesting name, like, I don't know, add an element to the UI, if that's something that I wanted to learn how to do. I would go into that commit, I would look at the entire code change set, and I would copy it by hand into a notebook. Commit tracing helped me accelerate my skill development process faster than any other technique that I've used. The thing about commit tracing is that it depends on other developers having left commits that are clearly named, that contain all of the changes necessary for the thing that the commit message says, and contain no or very few extraneous changes that are not related to what the commit message says. And that's a big ask, right? We don't necessarily always do that on projects. A lot of commit messages will be fixed bug, or depending on how long you've been working on fixing the bug, maybe just an expletive and nothing else. Which sometimes is fine, but it's something that I think about a lot more now when I'm writing code. I'm making a commit and I think, if a programmer with less experience than me were to come in behind me and attempt to use my commits as a learning resource, would this commit be worthy of being used as a learning resource? I try to make all of my commits well circumscribed and clearly named so that as often as possible, I'm leaving artifacts in the world that somebody else can use. I also started keeping this blog about 5 years ago. I didn't really know what to write about when I first started this blog, but the posts that have consistently been the most popular have been the ones where I detailed a process that was really, really difficult for me to figure out how to do. Some of my more recent posts, I think, are my better written posts, maybe the posts that would be most useful to the tech community at large. Those are not the most popular posts. The most popular post is how to test drive a recycler view in Android. I wrote this post like 3 years ago, and the method that it describes is not the method that I would use today. And so I've thought about taking it down a whole lot. But the truth is that even if I wouldn't do it now the way that I do it in that post, I would still rather somebody do it that way than not do it at all. And so I've left the post up. What I've learned from that post is that when I'm tearing my hair out to do something, I'm probably not the only one. That often other people have been tearing their hair out to do it too. And so when I'm tearing my hair out to figure out how to do something, that's a good indication that a tutorial on how to do this would be useful on the internet. And so that's what I end up putting up on my blog a lot these days. So that's what I have for you on that. It's, I make a big effort now to leave artifacts in the world so that others can learn from what I've created without me necessarily being present. So let's recap a little bit what we've talked about. Today, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and assume we're all in tech for now. We're in a constantly changing field, and we have already learned to adapt to that field all the time, right? To level up passively. We can also learn to level up deliberately. We can do it by developing a specific vision. We can do it by strengthening and relying on our discipline. We can do it by asking questions and fishing for answers. And we can do it by leaving artifacts in the world that allow other people to learn from what we have learned before. That's what I have for you. Thanks. Awesome. If folks have questions, I'll answer questions.
What blog post was like most fulfilling for you to write?
The blog post that was the most fulfilling for me to write, I will show you. So there have been a few. I think this is probably one of them. A rubric for evaluating team members' contributions to an inclusive culture. So this essentially talks about how to make inclusion part of the way that you evaluate employees, because we tend to ask some questions about it at the beginning of the interview process, but the way that we then value employee work tends to be based on individual contributions rather than based on how an employee contributes to the way that the team works together. And that makes it, you know, when we don't have a way to reward employees for doing that, it can be difficult for them to figure out how to improve at that and to prioritize it. And so this talks about 5 things that, 5 specific skills that you can work with employees on and that you can evaluate employees on. So this is probably one of the more fulfilling ones that I've heard. The other one is, why do remote meetings suck so much? This is a little bit of a Trojan horse article, I would say, because it is about why remote meetings suck, but the reason remote meetings suck is because they amplify all the reasons that regular meetings suck. And so it's about why regular meetings suck and how to make regular meetings not suck so that remote meetings also do not suck. But people don't want to hear that regular meetings suck, so I had to start with remote meetings. Those are probably the 2 that are most fulfilling for me to write. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Is that all? Any questions? What's that?
How do you come up with the practice projects when you're talking about learning machine learning?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I find that I often find myself identifying what I see as a gap in the industry or where I'm working or those types of things, and then brainstorming what sort of solutions might be useful for that kind of thing. That doesn't necessarily work in all cases. So one thing that I have found is that, depending on the tech stack, but in technology, it's not uncommon for a client to want to do some kind of data visualization project. And so if I don't have another idea for a practice project, I'll do some kind of data visualization project. The reason for that is that it's a really good project for spanning the entire stack. I have to understand front-end things in order to be able to design a visualization that's useful, and then create the view that's going to produce that visualization. I also have to be able to serve that visualization up on screen, so that's the controller layer. I also need to be able to get the data for that visualization, manipulate the data into the format that the visualization is going to require. So that's my back-end data access and data visualization stuff. And I have found that valuable for learning to test drive things. I have found that valuable for learning web frameworks. So if I have no other ideas, I'll start with what would be an interesting data visualization problem in this stack. Yeah.
I have to go because I have a meeting, but in case I need to ask you something in future, what is the best way to reach out to you? Can
I would
on
say
LinkedIn or something?
Probably on, well, this
ChelseaTordic.com?
yeah, my email is chelsea@chelseatroy.com.
Okay, thank you, and that presentation was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So the commit tracing thing?
Yep.
So it's kind of like doing a code review, sort of, right? And it seems like you're killing two birds with one stone, kind of. I mean, because you are like checking someone's work, sort of, even though if you're a junior, you're not, or maybe you are. I mean, you're learning and you're kind of like, it's an interesting thing. And have you been able to like get other people to jump onto that type of bandwagon?
It's a good question. It's a little bit of a tough one because some people think it's a little intense to do. I have enjoyed it. I have found it useful, and on a number of occasions, like you said, I found things in commits where I wondered, like, why didn't they do it this way? And on a couple of occasions, I've even like checked out the commit and done it the way I thought it should be done, and see if it worked. And sometimes it did, and sometimes, more often, I started to understand why they did it.
Have you ever gone back to the committer and kind of said, hey, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, it's like, yeah, you have to know the person. I mean, you can't just, but.
I have on a couple of occasions. It depended a little bit on the person.
Yeah.
Which is maybe an argument for being approachable in tech, is like people will come to you with their ideas if you're approachable. And if you're not approachable, then even if they find something, they're not gonna. But yeah, I have. I wrote about how to do commit tracing here. So this talk is based on a 20-post series that I did on leveling up, which goes into like the deep details of how to do some of the stuff that I talked about. And so if you're interested in the details of some of it, there's like probably a blog post on it. This one walks all the way through exactly how I trace commits, like what color pens I use for different parts of the commit tracing process. This is an example. This is what my notebook looks like after I've done commit tracing. And then I talk about like why it's working for me. But,
yeah, because like I'm thinking about my commit, and I think people would hate to look at them because I do like kind of like just cram a lot of stuff in there. That's probably wrong. So this is kind of like shedding a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. The better circumscribed the commit is, the easier it is to trace.
So do you like squashing a lot more then than like merging?
Oh, good question. I have found I will end up a lot of times while I'm like working on something incrementally, I'll have various whip commits in there, and then I'll end up squashing them down and describing sort of how I did things. My view on commit messages is also a little bit unorthodox in that I think that, like, I'll include a one-liner at the top that explains what it does, but if there's other context that needs to be included, I'll include that below that in the body of the commit message. And I know that people think the commit messages should only be 80 characters or whatever, but I like to use them as built-in documentation as to why I made the choices I made.
So how do you choose to like let skills go to the wayside, or if you like when you've acquired enough skills that keeping them all up to date sounds like it might, like I'm starting to hit that. And I wonder, how do you maintain skill or selectively decide what to let go?
I let skills go by the wayside. Before I became a programmer, I was training to be a spy, and when you are doing that, you learn a number of things, and one of the things you learn about is integrating with other cultures where they speak a foreign language. So it's not uncommon for somebody in the intelligence community who does human intelligence overseas to need to be fluent in somewhere between 9 and 15 languages over the course of their career at different points. They're not supposed to be fluent in all of them at once. And one of the things you learn is that if you sort of like half-assedly try to maintain your fluency in a language, your fluency in that language will get worse. However, if you're not using a language and you just let it sit in your long-term memory, then later, years later, you can come back and like immerse yourself for about a month, and that month of immersion will re-access the long-term memory where your previous proficiency remains largely intact. Yeah. So having learned that, I also apply that to software engineering. Now there is a difference, the difference being that languages don't change so much that your understanding of the language is obsolete after 8 months, usually, right? It's more like 80 years for spoken language. So it does work a little bit differently, but I have found that the re-immersion process, allows me to get back to my previous level of fluency much, much faster than I was able to get there the first time. So I tend to rely on that.
Really great talk. One thing that kind of didn't sit well from the talk was when you started mentioning HTTP request history in 1969.
Yeah.
Like I totally get the ask questions and do projects to level up, but like that's a depth I would never go down because it just doesn't, like it's just not practical enough for me, and it's embarrassing to admit that I don't know the history of HTTP requests and REST and all this stuff, but I'm very well at using them, you know, in my language of choice. So I guess my question is like, how do you balance the sort of like the questions that you're asking and the stuff you're trying to get out of that when it's not necessarily for, you know, your making money project or, you know, like the reason that you're trying to learn it, like how do you balance that?
Totally. So that was a real example, and the reason that I was using that the reason that I was doing that at the time was related to a professional, I don't know if I would call it a qualm, but so are you all familiar with GraphQL? This is a Facebook technology that allows you to delineate a request in the body of your request to determine what you're going to get back from the API. Different from REST in that you could hit the same endpoint with a different body and potentially receive a different response. People talk about it as the new hotness. And I, at the time, was getting frustrated with that because GraphQL uses a very similar overall protocol to something that we used in the 90s called SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, that programmers shat on for being a terrible solution. But GraphQL follows a lot of the same principles. I think it's extremely important if we are to mature as an industry for us to understand some of that history, because understanding that we have tried this before allows us to avoid pitfalls that we ran into before, and allows us to continue to improve rather than following a cyclical process where we think the same 3 things are new every 15 years. So that was the reason that I was diving into that. If you're interested in it, I know I'm doing like a bunch of shameless blog.
No, it's great. Like I love this.
So this is a 3-part series about everything that I learned in that process. But the idea was that I wanted to marshal evidence for like what was GraphQL new, what's new about it relative to previous protocols, and in the process learned a lot of really interesting things. For example, the way that we canonically think of REST as a professional, as professionals, is not, a lot of the things that we think are canonically REST are not things that Roy Fielding ever said. And maybe that's fine. He's not the sole like arbiter of what REST is, but the original paper that was written in 2001 doesn't say anything about a lot of the stuff that we think of as like hard and fast rules of REST. Yeah.
Did you end up liking GraphQL?
Did I end up liking GraphQL? I like so I think that GraphQL is an excellent solution in certain circumstances. I think that REST and GraphQL both like They're both useful protocols, and there are certain problems on which each or the other might be.
So, and this question isn't fully formed, so I apologize in advance. How do you stop yourself, so when you're trying to learn or level up in this skill, how do you stop yourself from going down the rabbit hole of related but different skills? An example is, I'm trying to learn Ruby on Rails right now for like a different side project, and the thing that I'm working on with that has a big jQuery component that I had to build for it. So now I'm like diving down the jQuery hole, which is leading me to, well, is jQuery the right thing? Should I do? Should I use another framework? There's 10,000 to pick. So how do you sort of, this is kind of like one step removed from how do you stop going down the holes of articles, but how do you stop going down the holes of this tech is related to that tech, which is related to this one, which is related to that one. So if you want to go back and start with the first one, how do you?
That's an excellent question. I think particularly when I already have a project that sort of stops me from going to a certain depth, sometimes that project might require different technologies or different techniques or that kind of thing. That's a hard one. I still sometimes end up in that situation. What helps me, I think, in those circumstances is I'll think about what I'm trying to do. And I'll, for example, say it's jQuery. I've got this Ruby on Rails app. I can kind of reflect occasionally on like, what am I trying to do right now? Am I trying to do a bunch of things at once? If I were to only pick one thing, what would that one thing be? And also, like, what's the most rudimentary thing I can do for now that's like maybe doesn't involve all these other components, and then maybe I can circle back. So for example, with regard to jQuery, which is its own whole animal, I might try to figure out, can I do it with plain JavaScript for now, which I know better, or can I do it with just straight up ERB and it doesn't update at all unless I refresh the page and not use any JavaScript at all and implement it that way, and then figure out how to come back and implement these components more smoothly with JavaScript or jQuery. Probably how I would do that. I don't know that I have a good answer as to how often to do that check-in, but with practice, I have learned to identify sooner and sooner that I'm trying to do two things at once and figure out how to pare it down. Good? Any questions?
So in terms of leveling up on specific skills or picking up, little bits of new languages, I moved into tech and data science from from physical science programming stuff. And I thought about doing the pick a project to learn whatever you need to do the project route. That seemed too daunting at the time. So I actually started doing the little bite-sized HackerRank things where they, you just go through the list of these baby projects, baby problems. And I found that helped a lot because I didn't need to come up with the problem. There were solutions if I really couldn't figure it out or whatever. And that worked great for me. But so many people crap on HackerRank, like exercise things. And I'm just wondering, why?
Yeah.
Like I don't pipe up when people are talking shit about HackerRank, blah, 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 blah. Just had this stupid interview and they give me this HackerRank crap, blah, blah. I always found it super helpful. So that's clearly not something that you have done. Like you've gone a different route, a much more sort of in-depth route. Could you maybe give me a sense of what you like about the more in-depth route as opposed to these like Mickey Mouse, like learn, a crumb at a time kind of methods?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I found that the in-depth route is helpful for me chiefly because, and this might be unique to me, but usually when I'm looking to pick up a skill in programming, it is rarely learning for learning's sake. I usually have a goal of something that I'm trying to accomplish, and this skill that I'm trying to pick up is a means to an end. I know that that's not the case for everyone, and I think that, in the case of learning for learning's sake, those smaller challenges are really helpful. And they may be helpful in the other case too. I just often typically have a vision in my mind of stuff I'm trying to do, and the way that I have found most motivating to learn is to go ahead and start doing those things. That having been said, I want to talk a little bit about what you were talking about with regard to HackerRank. I think HackerRank, I love the idea of circumscribed projects with like solutions that people have already done. I think a lot of the ire, and this is just me, but I think a lot of the ire with regard to HackerRank doesn't have to do with what HackerRank is so much as how companies are attempting to use HackerRank as their interview process. The thing about that is that HackerRank challenges are there are a couple of things about it. So I'm not going to rant at y'all about the way the code challenges are written very thoughtlessly at a lot of companies, but when I'm doing a code challenge, I check to make sure that it is related to the job that I am being hired for, because shockingly, pretty often it's not. And I also check to make sure that it's going to be interesting and I'm going to learn something. And I also check to make sure that they are evaluating me on the quality of what I'm writing and not on my speed in like a way that wouldn't be relevant in a work context. So the thing is that when a company hands somebody a HackerRank challenge, it usually fails the first and the third of those, and sometimes it even fails the second one. And people feel like they're being forced to spend their time on something that the company didn't put any time or thought into. So I think that's where the ire comes from, as opposed to HackerRank itself, which when used as you've described can be a really useful tool. That's just my opinion, and everyone here might disagree with me, and that's fine.
I, for one, completely agree with you in terms of the way that they're used for interview process. Some of the best programmers I've known have totally bombed those things because they just didn't know, okay, well, I'm getting some error about how I'm supposed to submit this. Like, you're being tested. I don't know if you've used HackerRank before. Anyway, so in that regard, I totally agree with you. We don't have to have a blog post about that rant. I would,
Matter of fact.
that's something that a well-formed description of that is something I would happily send to a number of people.
So this is where I tell companies what their code challenge needs to be like for me to do it. And it describes what I have explained. And here's, so the code challenge needs to line up with the job you're hiring me to do. It has to be interesting. The time frame has to cover multiple programming sessions. The reason being, a time frame that spans sessions is realistic. Like, normally you come in Monday through Friday and you work on code. It's not like you have 4 hours to do this thing, unless you're literally being hired into a competitive speed hacker position, which is not ever what I'm being hired into. So, yes, is the answer.
Thank you very much.
Hi, can you talk a little bit more about how you get help from like people you don't know? Because I feel like when I'm working on a project, doing something new, and I'm just probably copying from some other people's example if I want to add some feature. And when something doesn't work as expected, usually I can't quite figure out which part doesn't work. And like if I want to post like a question on Stack Overflow, people usually ask for like reproducible examples or something, but I almost feel like I need to give them my whole code base to have them look at. So just always have this struggle. Like if I can single out the part that it actually has the issue, then I probably already figure it out. But if not, like I feel just very, very messy, and if I need to get help, I feel like I need someone to look my code base. So like, how do you?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so y'all are gonna hate me, but I'm about to do it again. Yes, there's a post on this, which I think is gonna be really helpful. And specifically about asking for help. So this one is about asking for short-term help, which is like, I have a question about this stack. I need it answered by someone who knows this stack. There are other posts on how to get like long-term mentorship type of help, but I think this is what you're asking about. So with regard to seeking one-on-one help, there are some sort of like tricks that I use with regard to how to ask and who to ask. So basically I have sort of a list of sources that I will go to if I'm trying to figure out an answer to a question about some code. First, I'll look at the code itself if I can, the tests, if it has tests, the code itself, the documentation. If all of those things have been exhausted and I haven't been able to figure out the answer to my question, then I'll look on some of these forums you're mentioning, like Stack Overflow. The thing about Stack Overflow is like people could sometimes be really mean on there. So I tend to not ask questions. I'll look at other people's questions, but I tend to not ask questions on there. If I need to ask a question, I'll ask on askquestions.tech, which is specifically supposed to be like a nicer Stack Overflow. So that's where I'll go next. After that, I'll go to developer advocates. So developer advocates are people who are hired by companies specifically to help developers use their products. For J Hat, a lot of different databases have them, a lot of different open source projects even have them, particularly ones that are sponsored by like Microsoft or one of those big companies. And the developer advocate's whole job is to make it so that you can use the software. So they have excellent people skills and excellent technical skills. I think of developer advocates as sort of like the heroes of our tech world. So I'll go there. If I can't find a developer advocate, I will go to a developer that I trust and see if they know how to do it. And then if I can't find a developer I trust to ask about it, then I'll go to a core maintainer. The thing about a core maintainer is they're usually very busy, and so I don't necessarily expect an answer from a core maintainer. This is like pretty down the list, obviously. And when I'm doing that, I make very sure that I am asking them in a format that's going to be palatable to them. And so when I'm asking somebody I know, I'll tend to Slack them or text them or email them or something like that. And when I'm asking a core maintainer, I'll generally see like if there's a Gitter forum or some kind of help forum specifically for that technology, and I'll ask them on there. I'll also make sure to express a lot of gratitude because core maintainers, also heroes of the tech world because they build stuff that we use for free and then we yell at them. So I try to make sure that they understand how much I appreciate it.
I just have one comment about the core maintainers too. Like if you ask them in a public forum, I maintain a large project online. Like if you ask in a public forum, like a GitHub issue, and they have this other stuff that's in a queue, you're less likely to respond to someone on a one-off in a public because it shows to the other people that you've ignored for months that they're not important, right? So like I'm more apt to respond to someone on Slack or on Twitter, like where it's not in the open, and or like LinkedIn where it's not showing to everyone else that I've ignored all this other stuff, right?
That's a good tip. I didn't know that.
Well, it's not that I'm ignoring, it's just like, it's just that
You're busy.
stuff piles up, right? And
It's a lot.
Yeah.
What do you maintain if you don't want to ask?
So I maintain a project called Chart Museum. It's very specific to Kubernetes world.
So you leave some time for leveling up. Do you also leave time for blogging? And I mean, do you have like, I'm going to blog at least, X hours a week or?
I sort of do. I'll go through like periods where I'll write like 12 posts, and then I'll go through periods where I write 0 posts. And so I save the 12 posts to like distribute throughout the time when I'm writing 0 posts. But yeah, I tend to leave time for it. I was working full time up until the beginning of the summer, and now I am freelancing, which has given me the opportunity to craft my schedule a little bit more. And lately I've been doing more of the blog drafting type stuff on Fridays. So that's the plan now. We'll see if it works. Other questions? All right, you can email me at chelsea@chelseatroy.com, and you can reach me otherwise here. Thanks, everybody.